it's time to get started. Welcome everyone, including people who are just arriving. There are some seats in the front row if you find yourself without a chair. My name is Ryan Heath. I'm the political editor of Politico Europe, which you find at politico.eu and in print. I want to welcome you back to what I consider to be just out of the post-lunch graveyard shift. Hopefully the coffee has had a little bit of time to kick in, but I recognize that this is the moment that we need to try and have a dynamic session, keep you all engaged. So before we dive into that, I want to do a little bit of housekeeping. Obviously, we're here to talk about the future of work, so let's stick to that theme, as broad as it is. We're going to have at least 30 minutes of questions from you. But before we get there, we'll allow the speakers up on the stage to introduce their perspectives. Then I'll come to you and we'll let them have a little moment to wrap up at the end. We're also going to run 2 polls throughout the session. So you've been getting the instructions on the screen behind me as you were arriving. Make sure you check that out as it reappears on the screen. It's a system called Bcast, and it will allow you to tell us where you are sitting in this very uneven landscape of labour today. So let's give some context first before we get to the panelists. The theme this year, of course, is how we can bring people together. And that means in this context, we're going to focus on both the aspirations and the anxieties, as well as the concrete examples of people who are able to succeed in this difficult labour market today. How are we able to live well together? The OECD already does a huge amount of work in this field. It's a field that has around 2 billion people, according to the ILO, who are not in secure work. They're working, but they don't know necessarily where the next round of income, where the long-term sustainability of their career is going to be. It's a world where even higher paid workers sometimes lack the social safety nets that we've built into our own self-image, into our national narratives. They're not necessarily there, even for people who are doing well. It's a world where job categories are being created and wiped out quicker than we ever imagined when all of us were in school. And that obviously includes from factors like automation and artificial intelligence. So it's not just the displacement of manufacturing workers, it's coming to the service sector as well. And of course, there have been persistent gender gaps from time immemorial, and there is growing inequality, just to make things positive and fun for the start of the discussion. So very clearly, we could have a whole forum just on this issue. What we've got is 90 minutes, so I'm going to introduce our panelists now, and then we can dive straight into it. Let's go from my left to my right. We've got Arnaud Devine, who is from Indeed France. He can tell you a bit more about himself, but think of it as the Google for job search. Then we have Jacques van den Broek, who is the CEO and chairman of the executive board of Randstad, a very familiar established name in job matching, labor placement, and so on. Then Ronnie Goldberg, who comes to us as senior counsel from the United States Council for International Business. And we're not going to put the weight of 50% of the world's labor force on you, Ronnie, but we are going to make sure there is a fair representation of your gender, both up here and in your questions, that's for sure. Then Luca Visentini, who is the General Secretary of the European Trade Union Confederation. And then we have Thibaut Somphal, who is the Regional General Manager for Western and Southern Europe for Uber, who obviously are a very big and sometimes controversial participant in these labour markets that I've been talking about. Now, before I take my seat and we dive into the discussion, I actually want to bring you in straight away with that first poll that I was mentioning. So we're going to get that poll up onto the screen. You can follow the instructions that are on your seat as well. That allows you to go to bcast.com, and what we're going to ask you to do is tell us what type of job you have now. We're going to hear more on the statistics of where gig work and independent work is going, but we want you to tell us, do you have independent work, or are you a permanent full-time employee? There we go. So as I take my seat, get busy answering that question, and we'll see the results in real time. It helps to have this. What are we seeing up here? Well, I was not expecting this. I was expecting you to be a room full of full-time employees, and then I was going to tell you how out of touch you were with the current labor market. I'm going to have to revise this narrative. But as we get into revising that narrative, maybe, Arnaud, can I kick off with you? You have access to vast troves of data, what is going on across all different sorts of job markets. So tell us, what are the trajectories that you're seeing for things like gig work? Oh, here we go. Oh, now we're normalizing. Now we're stabilizing, folks. So what are the sort of numbers and trajectories you're seeing? And are the people who do this work, is that data indicating that they're happy with it? Or are they constantly shifting, constantly looking for more and better?
So, hello everyone. As you may know, Indeed is the biggest job site in the world. We're kind of a search engine, as you said. So we have more than 200 million unique visitors every month across 60 different markets. So this gives us the opportunity to be like the control tower of what's going on in the labor market. We have lots of real-time data. We don't need to do like surveys. We can just watch what's happening on our platforms, on our servers, to see what's going on the supply and demand side. Plus, we do kind of research as well. We have a hiring lab internally that conducts some research and do some specific deep dives. And we've observed, exactly as you said, some major shifts in the labor market those past few years. One of the main one we saw, of course, which is not going to be a surprise for you, is a massive surge of what we call the gig economy and a kind of more flexible type of jobs. We see that trend, but one, it's a structural trend. Many people thought that it was like basically the outcome of the 2008 crisis. And at that time, I remember like many observers were saying maybe it's a very short-term thing, and it will just disappear in a few years. It's more structural. And actually, if you just have a look at what happened in those past 2 years on our platform, the number of jobs that look like kind of Uber drivers type of jobs was multiplied by 3 over the past 2 years. So it shows how fast the demand from this kind of workforce is growing fast. But we also realize that on the other hand, on the other side, on the job seeker side, there is more and more demand for this kind of flexibility and independent type of jobs. If we surveyed job seekers internationally to ask them what were their main criteria when it was about like looking for a job and choosing a job. And after, of course, like compensation, location of the job, then flexibility is by far what they value most, especially true for millennials, Y generation. They really value this kind of flexibility. So this is kind of supported by some research like McKinsey report. I don't know if you've read interesting report from them on the gig economy, where it shows that in France, just in France, for instance, 70% kind of gig economy workers do it because they decide to do it. It's not because they are financially constrained and not because they have to do it. But of course, it leaves like 30% who have to do it. And this is an important discussion we need to have about how do we make sure that when they do it in like fair, like social conditions, etc. So overall, we see this massive change to a much more flexible job market, where job seekers also become very opportunistic and kind of switch very quickly from one job to the other. Like our research shows that more than 60% of people who just started a new job keep searching for their next role, just 3 months after starting a new job.
But did you sign them up to some kind of daily newsletter where they're being fed their addiction to the labor market, or are they going back and...
Actually, that's a good point. We have a very efficient alert on smartphones. So if you don't basically stop the notifications, you get some kind of cool opportunities every day. So it's probably supported by what we always call the FOMO, fear of missing out, you know, kind of young generation think that they can always find something better. So they're extremely opportunistic, just like we are all as consumers. It's basically like job seekers behaving like consumers. So it's a major thing that recruiters have to take into account. It's a very like long-term trend that we're experiencing.
I might bring Thibaut in here at that point, because I think, Thibaut, you found that your driver partners, that they love the flexibility as well, but you're also recognizing there's shifts and there's backlash out there, and you've come up with a new insurance package for the people who are driving for you. So tell us a little bit about that, but beyond the sort of talking points, what needs to happen for companies like Uber to really manage all of those competing demands, the people who are saying, okay, we love an opportunity, but it can't just blow up everything that came before it?
Yeah, I think that's right. Like, as being said, and as you just said, it's a massive opportunity. On Uber globally, you've got 3 million drivers and couriers who deliver food using the app every day, and that's access to work, which is great. But like you said, I think it does come with a number of questions and anxieties that we have to listen to, and I think as Uber in the past, we have not listened enough to these anxieties, and now we've very much shifted our approach to make this a strategy of listening properly and adapting our model as is needed. And we've done this in many ways, because there can be words first, and there needs to be a vision, but then there needs to be action. The words where we have a vision where everyone who engages on the Uber platform and uses it is entitled to protection for themselves and their loved ones. That's the vision. Now for action, what we've done is, and that's one example that you just mentioned, but I can go into other examples. We've signed across Europe for all of the EU countries a partnership with AXA, a global leading insurer, to add protection, which is not required by the regulations, on sickness and injury, on events of life like paternity and maternity payments, and we're willing to go into more.
And that's kind of using your scale to get a good deal for
yes,
those people driving.
And multi-country, and also what we want to do is, exactly to your point, is we want to show the way. I think in the past what we've done was being reactive to some of these challenges, and if it's a demand but we don't feel it's a requirement from the regulatory perspective, we thought we would see. Now what we want to be is ahead of the curve and very much show the way to the entire industry. And we thought this could work, and it is actually working. What we see in France, for example, in the UK and the US, is that by doing that, we managed to have a lot of the platforms come with us and have constructive, structured conversations with governments, with authorities, with unions, with the media, to see what can we do, and have very concrete action items on the table, and not very fluffy visions.
Mm-hmm. Now, Luca, what can trade unions do in this space? The gig economy, the more flexible environment, it's harder to organize in that environment. So what are you doing, or what do you want to do to make sure companies like Uber and others are constructive as well as disruptive? And what's your value add to people who basically don't see the value that unions, or the historical value that unions have provided to society? People don't necessarily see how that applies in this new environment. So how are you changing in order to be successful in that environment?
Well, first of all, in general, as trade unions, we need to change a bit our approach, to be able to face these changes that are happening in the labor market. First of all, we have to stop fighting against these changes and try to interpret the changes, to try to understand the changes, what they are happening, how they are happening, and what trade unions can do to protect workers that are affected by these changes. This is the first element. We need, let's say, to change a bit our culture, to be more effective in addressing the problems we have in front of us. The second point is that we need to be in touch with the people that are affected by these changes. Try to understand the specificities that they are facing. It's not the same situation being a worker in Uber or in another platform, or being a worker in the digital economy, or being a worker in a steel industry that is affected by climate change or by digitalization and automation. These are completely different contexts. Of course, some of these workers, especially the last ones, they are already our members. And so our problem is how to protect them. How to protect them from these changes to happen in a way that completely destroy their jobs and don't offer to them any other alternative opportunity. But on the other side, we need also to try to enter into the different mentality that an independent worker in a platform or in the gig economy wants to protect. They want to keep some independency. We have to recognize this. Of course, not all of them as he was saying, I mean, some of the workers that are working in the platform economy or in the gig economy, well, they didn't want to have a temporary job or a precarious job or an independent job. They are there simply because they are waiting for something better. But there are also some of them that really enjoy to be independent. So we need to understand their point of view. And then the third point is that we need to provide them with concrete solutions. And you know, this is the most challenging part of the picture, because of course, on the one side, when it comes to climate change, automation, digitalization affecting traditional industries, but as you said at the beginning, also traditional services, well, in this case, you know, we can talk a lot about skills, upskilling people, providing them with training, etc., etc. But if you lose your job and you don't have another job opportunity, you can be the best trained person in the world, but you will be still an unemployed, very skilled worker. And so we need, in this respect, I mean, to put in place also public policies, investment, capacity of governance, I mean, to make sure that this transition can really be a just transition. But on the other side, the problems in the gig economy, in the platform economy are completely different, because in that case, if we want to respect the independency and this different mood, I mean, that these workers have, fine, that's okay. We need really to encourage them, I mean, to be active in self-protecting them, but at the same time, they need also some safety nets, because they are not able very often to bargain their remuneration with the clients. Sometimes they are even prevented to work for more than one client or for more than one platform, and this is a problem. Their data are not always protected properly, and they don't have proper social protection, expectation for pension, I mean, maternity leave, paternity leave, etc., etc. So all these elements have to be introduced for these workers, of course, in a different way than in the past, because they are very atypical, and so they need also atypical tools to protect them. And in this respect, we have also good practices and worse practices. There are some pirates in this area, I mean, that simply don't want to protect their workers, I mean, and they don't even be responsible as an employer, but we have also very good practices. Uber became, I have to recognize this, and by the way, we are also negotiating with them, I mean, they became an ethic employer in this respect, because they took the responsibility, I mean, to start a dialogue and to see what kind of concrete solutions can be provided to these workers. There is a very good example we had in the past. That was the example about the temporary work agencies. At the really beginning, they were the pirates in the labor market, but then we succeeded to have a fantastic industrial relation and dialogue with them that led to one of the best collective bargaining frameworks we can have at the global level, and particularly in Europe. That's true. But you know, it's sectoral agreements. It's not company-level only agreements, because through a fragmented approach, we cannot build up proper industrial relations. We need to keep the value of collective bargaining in the sectors. This is the tool that we together we can use to protect these workers and at the same time to improve the performances of these new types of companies, I think.
Thank you, Luca. Well, that's a perfect moment to bring in Jacques. Workers, whether they're employees, whether they're independent, sometimes they have to rely on their employer, sometimes they have to rely on a trade union to get things for them. But what self-initiative do workers need to take in order to not suffer, to actually thrive in this turbulent world?
Yeah, so we very much believe we are on the verge of real change, and I totally agree with Luca. We shouldn't say it's not going to happen. But we need to recognize what everybody wants, regardless of the job relation or contract they're having. Everybody wants a certain security, a certain perspective, and that sort of thing. And we just asked some 70% is in fixed employment, but we always say the security of a fixed job is overrated and the security of a flexible job is underrated. We need to reinvent social security, because if 30% is not automatically in the system in terms of healthcare and that sort of thing, I don't think we can just rely on the Ubers of this world to take their responsibility and provide security, so to say. So there's another question on who needs to do this later. You'll get a question later. But it's all of the above. And I do think that employees underrate their own necessity to do something, because there's only one form of protection, and that's your capabilities. And by the way, this is where digitization, because we take a very positive approach around the possibilities of digitization, this is where digitization helps. Because we, as a company, we now offer everybody access to insight into their own employability. Because Luca, absolutely, if tomorrow you lose your job, there should be a safety net, but it's even better if you find directly a different job, right? And the good news is there's low unemployment, there's a huge skills mismatch, but we're going to be massively short of people. And you need to know, if you're 45 years old, tomorrow you lose your job, will you find a different job tomorrow? With your current training, maybe not, then please be retrained, and the digital will show you, data will show you where to go and where to be trained. But if you wait for it, you'll be dead in the water. And there might be a safety net, but the safety net is only for, a few months. And if your capabilities are not great, you've got a problem. And that's where employees need to fit in and need to take their own responsibilities.
Now, Ronnie, I want to acknowledge that you actually asked to go last here because you've got some quite horizontal perspectives to bring to the discussion. So let's think about the gender dimension here. Tell us a bit more about how structural that issue is and some concrete examples of where people have actually been able to succeed in doing things like close gender pay gaps and make sure that people have fair opportunities to the labor situation.
Well, I've been sitting here thinking, oh, brave new world. And oh, brave new world has 50% of women in it. 50% of the human resources available, 50% of the talent, of the creativity, of the potential innovation, which is what all these platforms depend on, and what the platforms, the new platforms, will depend on. And although I think women face many of the same issues, all of the same issues as anyone else, there are some specific gender issues, gender gaps that I think we need to pay attention to. I heard a panel this morning on women in tech where there was data on the fact not only that women are terribly underrepresented in the tech world, but that women leave tech at twice the rate as men. Now, why? Well, work-life balance issues, which relate to the flexibility we've been talking about, is part of it. And maybe part of the answer is being able to be more in control of your own life and your own schedule, and to be able to juggle childcare and senior care. But that's not the only part of it. Part of it is cultural, part of it is societal, part of it is the structure of enterprises where biases may be totally or largely unconscious. And so I think women face particular challenges. The platform economy, the gig economy ought to be a boon for women, but it won't happen automatically. And by the way, it certainly won't happen automatically that women are involved at senior levels at Google or Uber or any of these other platforms, and they ought to be. They ought to be in there in equal numbers to men designing, right? Because after all, that's 50% of the consumer market. So the OECD has done a great deal of work in this regard. There's a council recommendation on gender issues in employment, on entrepreneurship and education, with recommendations for governments. Business at OECD has taken up these subjects and done some intensive work on what companies need to do, not alone, but in partnership in each of these areas. And I think maybe if we have time later, we could share some interesting case studies.
Now, that question of flexibility is really interesting. So my question would be flexibility for who? Yes, if it means you can design a schedule around your needs, that's great. But if the relationship is asymmetric, if the flexibility is you have to drop everything and run to your next shift or your next gig at 2 minutes, and if you don't, you're out of an income stream, well, that's not really good for the child that's left at home, either by a man or a woman. I'm not saying that it's a woman who's in charge of childcare. It doesn't work when people want to have loving relationships and they're leaving one half sitting there on their own as well. How how are we doing on that power balance? Do you think that gig workers really do have a fair level of control, or is your sense that a lot of people are just stuck with less rights than they had before?
If you're really a gig worker, then you don't have instructions. So there's not an instruction that you show up because you voluntarily give your labor. It's very old-fashioned. So the war for talent is over and the talent has won. So please take a little bit of self-confidence here. I totally disagree with the fact that child caring, apart from the biological necessity to bear the child, is a woman's thing. I think it's both areas, and I think companies, and there's some good examples and some bad examples, and companies will totally miss out. Because if you don't tap into the women workforce, you will be massively short of people. So make your company more attractive or whatever. But I disagree with the fact that women need to work, which is in general the case. Certainly in my home country, 70% of women work, but 50% do part-time. Yeah, there is a bit of a thingy between working less and a career. So it's both ends. Companies need to look more and need to be more attractive for women, but women also, to a certain extent, need to play the game together with a spouse. It's a common responsibility.
I've got a question for you, Jacques, there.
Sorry?
So in some countries, and I think Netherlands might be one of them, but correct me if I'm wrong, school ends at lunchtime on Wednesdays in European countries. Do you think many men go and pick up the kids at lunchtime on Wednesday?
No, but
or
why?
is it actually...
Yeah, but
is that reinforcing an existing bias?
Yeah, well, there is some infrastructural stuff, but that doesn't necessarily need to go at the expense of women's careers. That's the point I'm making.
I would agree on that.
So
yes.
you got a family, you got a family, and you just take care of it. It's possible. Infrastructure, of course, needs to improve. It's still a choice. It's still a choice.
Please, Ronnie.
Can I leap in here? I agree with you entirely, except that in countries that have substituted maternal leave for family leave, what I think the data shows is that fathers are reluctant to take up paternal leave. They're reluctant for a variety of social and cultural reasons, but in large part because they're afraid of the impact on their own careers. Some countries, some OECD countries, have made it sort of mandatory, use it or lose it, to force men to take paternal leave. And that's an interesting and probably a useful approach. But it's one thing to talk about the theory and quite another to talk about how it actually plays out.
Yeah, well, there's direct link between companies that have diverse population, so to speak, and business success.
Yes, absolutely.
So it's a no-brainer as a company if you miss out here. And at least in the countries I'm looking at, it's quite clear that you need to shape up as a company. If not, you're out.
I agree with you, it's a no-brainer. And we've spent a lot of time talking about not just the human rights reason for gender equality, but the economic and development and business rationale for gender equality. Why aren't we further along? If it's so obvious, what's the problem?
Yeah, I don't know.
And it turns out, I think that it's complicated, right?
Yeah. Luca, you look like you wanted to dive in.
Well, there will be a lot of to comment on this, I mean, about theory and practice of gender equality. But I wanted to come back to the point you made, Ryan, that is really putting the finger where the problem is. That is the asymmetrical flexibility, and particularly the asymmetry in power between the different actors of this new economy, let's say. Because, well, it's true, okay, the individual, independent gig economy or platform economy workers, they should motivate themselves, have the right mood, I mean, have the capacity, I mean, to deliver, etc., and to protect themselves. But, alone, it's impossible to succeed. Here, what is really missing is the collective dimension. The only way for workers, any kind of worker, even independent workers and self-employed, to succeed in rebalancing the power is to organize collectively. Organize collectively in the trade unions, in other kind of organizations, in different, it depends on the nature of the work they are performing, of course, but organizing collectively is the first step. And the second step is to move from organizing collectively to bargaining collectively. and to having the power to negotiate with the employer, whoever or whatever the employer is in this case. And this is even not enough, because sometimes there are legal frameworks, laws, directives, any kind of regulation that prevent this kind of workers to organize collectively, to join a union. In some countries, it's forbidden for self-employed workers to join a trade union. It's forbidden because of the competition law to deliver collective agreements, because collective agreements are considered by several legal frameworks as infringement to the law, to the competition law. And for some of these workers, there is even not the possibility to have access to normal social protection systems, because since they are not normal contributors to the systems, they cannot get any benefit back for what they pay. So sometimes they pay for nothing. So these three elements are really the elements that we need to address if we want to change the situation. Give these people the possibility to organize collectively, give these people the possibility and the power to bargain collectively, and third, modify the legal frameworks that prevent these people to enjoy the same rights as the others. These are the three elements that need all the actors. It's about trade unions, it's about employers, it's about also public authorities. They have also to play a role in this respect, not to introduce more and more bureaucracy, but to make sure that regulations really fit for purpose, I think.
But you already provided the answer earlier when you said that because of the first actors in flexible work, which was us, the well-regulated industry, it's there. Yeah. There's collective bargaining. Exactly. We know that many gig workers effectively are temp workers. So there's a solution, right? And we already, well, recently made an agreement here.
You know, I think your example, the example of the temporary work agencies and in general the agency operating in the labor market is perfect, because it was really a successful case with collective agreements in the sectors, ruling everything, etc., and finding a way, I mean, to provide to these people the rights and a decent level of income, etc., etc. But the problem is that there is a difference. And the difference is that in most of the countries, at least in Europe, temporary agency workers, they are employees. They are more or less traditional employees. This is not the case for platforms. This is not the case for the gig economy. In this case, we have a prevalence of self-employed people, sometimes proper self-employed, sometimes bogus self-employed, sometimes something in the middle that is very difficult to define. Well, for these people, we don't have yet the tools available to do what we did with you. That was exactly what we want to achieve, but you know, the tools are not yet there. So we have to contribute all together to create these tools.
Arnaud and then Thibaut.
To illustrate your points and to build on it, I think there are some interesting initiatives actually happening in the gig economy where basically workers get together to wait more in the discussion or to offer an alternative solution to basically governments not being able to act fast enough to adapt to the change. I have the example in mind of the Black Car Fund. I think it's drivers in New York kind of get together and provide kind of security in case people get injured in an accident, etc. It's kind of cooperative. I think there are initiatives of the Deliveroo as well, employees. I think it's in Brussels, in Belgium, where they use a platform as a cooperative, in a cooperative system as well. It's called eSmart or something like that. And they basically built their own social insurance system. So it's really key, as you said, and there are some things happening, actually. Because
you're right, but in some cases they were obliged to go to court, you know, to remove the obstacles, legal obstacles, first of all, to achieve all this. I mean, so we have to consider this, unfortunately.
No, absolutely.
So Thibaut's been at the front lines of this.
Yeah,
so
just to chime in
what
here.
What was that like?
I agree there are many avenues, and I think all of these avenues are valid. Collective bargaining is definitely still present. We, as Uber, have engaged with a number of unions around the world, including your confederation, because that's one of the clear forums that is there to debate on things where you have experts that know, they have a membership base they can represent. I think if I take the company's angle for a minute, what technology enables you to do at scale, which was not necessarily possible before, is listening for real, getting data, and then moving in the direction of what your customers, your partners are asking. And as Uber, when we shifted our approach, including with insurance, social protection, social safety nets, on top of that, we started a host of initiatives across Europe to engage directly with drivers, couriers, deliverers, to ask them what you want, to consult them before we do a price change, to ask them where we can help the most. And we've realized some of the areas are retraining, for example, or getting them some help, concrete help to become a driver. Because in Europe, it is very difficult. It can take up to 1 year under the regulations to become a driver. In France, we launched a program called Campus VTC, which is for all drivers to help them get additional skills, which might help them transition to their next job. And all of these things, I think in the past were probably difficult because getting live feedback is hard, but with tech, you can actually poll, you can actually ask for opinions. And as a platform, I think there's a big change in mindset here where I think initially tech platforms, they see a need from customers, from consumers, they address that need. They don't necessarily look at the supply side, as in how do we offer that, what happens to the workers. I think now we're adding a layer to our thinking as platforms, thinking we are responsible for people engaging with the platform to provide work, and we have to listen to them as customers, as partners, and satisfy their needs. There's one which is completely proactive, being ahead of the curve, avoiding regulations that might come too late and with the wrong angle. But there's also a strong business angle, which is like for gender diversity. We've seen that this is the #1 way for us to make these gig economy workers be loyal to the platform, stick with us, and think we're the best. And it's very interesting because we've had a few markets where we launched some of these initiatives, and we have heavy competition. And some of our competition, they sometimes have more favorable conditions from a pricing standpoint or other standpoints, but overall, they prefer to stay with us because they feel we have provided some of these things they expected. And I think that's a big change in mindset for the platforms where we're trying to show the way again, and I think it has to also become a sector thing. We can't be alone, we have to do it as a broad sector, because I agree with your point on collective is better.
Just before we come to you, Ronnie, that's the perfect moment to bring the next poll up onto the screen, that question of responsibility. So Uber feels some responsibility here, but what do you in the room, who do you feel should be responsible for making sure the workforce has the right skills, education, all of those non-salary things that might help you live life well? Ronnie, jump in while everyone fills out the survey.
I wanted to ask an Uber question, following on from what you just said. I recently learned about an initiative in India to train female drivers and to provide a Uber-like service specifically for women, because there are special challenges for women traveling about in Indian cities. They don't feel safe necessarily, and they feel more safe if there's a female driver. So this, in theory, works well on a number of levels. It's empowering young women, it's giving them a skill, it's giving them a certain marketability even beyond this service. Does Uber have programs like that?
So we've done a number of initiatives in different countries that are specific to women needs in the market. I think Saudi Arabia is a good example for women drivers. And in general, on safety in India, we rolled out quite a few specific features to help with safety in general. I think on this specific example of having a service just for women, I think we take probably a higher approach on safety, which is safety is our #1 priority globally, and we want to be the safest platform for transportation everywhere and for everyone. And we think at this stage that addressing our consumers saying we're safer for women is probably the wrong message. We want to be absolutely safe for everyone. It is something that we continue to discuss internally because a lot of people ask us, but we just want safety for everyone at this stage. But I think for women in general, there are a lot of things we do more on the driver's side to ensure more diversity. What's interesting is that, and to the point here that we're polling, which is who's responsible, a very interesting stat that we see is that the more it is difficult to become a driver or a courier around the world, the least we have women working for the platform. The less barriers to entry there are in the sector to become a driver, the more women there are. And I think that's quite an interesting thing that resonates with the earlier discussion, as in what prevents more women in the workforce in some jobs. Well, this one is a clear example that regulation can help, it can also hurt.
Now, maybe an extension of this question of responsibility is to sharpen it up and say not just who is responsible, but who pays for an inclusive labor market. And so I mean in the sense of if you are working in casual or gig employment, how do you accumulate a pension? If you need childcare or parental leave when you've got an addition in the family, who is going to pay for that? And how do you even calculate that if someone isn't accruing a salary in the way that they traditionally have done through part-time and full-time work? I think maybe putting the money element in there sharpens up the thought.
You know, I think this is also where the regulator comes in, and because there's a large group of gig workers, but I think we need to talk more about, call it at least the bottom half from an educational point of view. And we've created a system where through collective bargaining, but we also in a way protect people against themselves. We protect people against themselves, and by buying it at bulk, we also provide services at a low cost, such as insurance. So we very much advocate at the bottom end of the labor market, in logistics, in construction, that sort of thing, to have a minimum rate for freelancers, and at the same time have the same obligatory insurance systems that we normally have in temp work or whatever. So I think that's a crucial point to make. At the end of the day, the consumer should pay. And there's something funny going on in logistics, in the whole web economy. There's free service, but we all know free service doesn't exist. So if tomorrow you would have, and Uber is doing great things, but you would have fully insured drivers, you would have fully insured warehouse and Deliveroo, the service would be more expensive. But yeah, let's hope that society also wants to pay for the protection of their peers in the labor market.
Who else? Luca.
Yeah. Let's take an example from your sector, your profession, journalist, in the media sector. So this is a traditional sector, but at the same time, it's also a very innovative sector where you have a lot of digitalization, let's say. And let's take my country of origin, Italy. Well, in Italy, out of all the media that exist in the country, 20% of the journalists have a collective agreement, okay? They have a contract and they earn a decent amount of money, let's say, a good salary. And then you have 80% of the others that are making the newspapers, they are making the websites, etc. They are independent. They earn more or less 5 to 30 euros gross amount per article. That very often means 5 to 30 euros gross amount per day. Because it's very rare that you write more than one article per day. If you are lucky, you write one article per day. In some cases, you write one a week, or 2 or 3 a month.
You might write more, but lower quality.
Yeah,
yeah,
exactly. So let's take this example. These people are independent workers. They have a VAT number, they write articles, they receive 30 euros in the best case, I mean, per article a day. This is their salary. This is their remuneration, I mean. They are obliged by the law to pay social security contribution and pension systems contribution. But it's clear that these people will pay so little to the system that in the end of their career, either there will be completely poor people with no pension and no social assistance, or the state will be obliged to supply and to pay instead of the contribution. So this means that either we will have an army of working pools that will be poor pensioners, or, as an alternative, we will have the public budgets completely destroyed in terms of sustainability by the fact that the systems will not work any longer. This is exactly where the money issue comes. So if we don't address the problem of a decent remuneration for these people and a real concrete access to social protection, well, it will be very difficult to make our society sustainable in the long run, I think.
Yeah, but this, I totally agree with you on the principle, but there are hardly any newspapers anymore that make money, because the business model of newspapers is gone. They used to live on ads are online, that's gone. So try bargaining with an employer that doesn't make money. So here you and that's atypical. Sorry about that.
No, sure, they don't.
We face it every day.
I'm
It's
not sure this is true, you know.
No, but
maybe
seriously.
traditional newspapers, maybe.
Yeah, no, but
you know,
in online there's not a lot of money.
If they differentiate in the web, they can.
Yeah, no. There's no. Yeah, no. We're not going to bargain here, and I don't own a newspaper. But this is a sector which is in trouble. So
it was an example, but you know, you have this kind of cases also in other sectors where there is money.
No, but yeah,
I'm
okay.
going to move out from between the two of
Yeah,
you,
that's
I
okay.
think.
That's okay. Yeah, but we need to spice it up a bit, right?
Ronnie, you're better positioned to referee.
Yeah.
So
But
Jacques,
what
wrap
should-
up and we'll
yeah.
move to Ronnie.
Yeah,
as
but what
referee.
should you do as a journalist? As a journalist, you should recognize, and I talk a lot to journalists. First, they interview me, then I start talking about their job perspective. It gets very quiet. This is changing. So you should say, what am I good at? I'm pretty good at hosting panels at events. So that should be
I forgot to charge.
No,
I'm
really.
absolutely terrible at this job. I'm doing this for free. Never mind the pension.
Yeah. Well, that's a tough job. But then, so
this creates fake news, you know.
Yeah.
In the media, this kind of situation we are facing, so poor journalists, I mean, this creates fake news. I mean, this escalates, I mean, the bubble of fake news in the media sector.
Oh my
and
God.
is deteriorating.
Now it goes quickly.
Definitely, it's deteriorating the quality of information. And this affects democracy.
You're going
and
Elon
this
Musk
comes
here,
also
Luca.
from
Now we
the
go
fact
quick. Now
that
we
these
go quick.
people don't earn money enough, you know. We need to address these problems. It's not only a matter of money for social protection systems. It's also a matter of democracy. If you have this kind of fragmentation in a specific sector, but I can mention other sectors that are very similar, you cannot have some workers that earn 3,000 euros a month and others that earn 300 euros a month in the same newspaper, in the same media, and the others that earn only 300 euros a month. Well, there will be a problem for the society. If we don't address this problem, well, it will be very difficult.
That's true.
No,
That's true.
To fix it.
I just don't agree with the model.
Okay, Ronnie, dive on in. Have you got anything to add to that discussion?
Well, at the risk of sounding like a one-trick pony here, what I was thinking was this problem of under-contributing to social protection, of winding up poor, has been a problem for women in general forever. So the problem itself is not unique. We've got new circumstances, but the underlying policy issues are really the same. Women, well, we've got the wage gap, we've got the fact of the leaky pipeline, women drop out of the career ladder and so tend in general to earn less. They drop out of jobs for a period of time to raise children because even though you're a 50% father, not everybody is. So this is not a brand new or unique issue.
But still I'm optimistic because if you look at where we're going to be terribly short on people, it's in education, it's on healthcare, which are jobs where women are also very well positioned. So there are opportunities. So I'm also a bit puzzled about why we cannot sort of bridge the gap here. I don't have the immediate answers.
Well, many brains are better than 6. So why don't we bring in some questions from the audience? I see Bettina from Adecco Group has a question. Cheryl has a question, and this lady here, look, 3 women, that's fantastic. That's a great way to start this session. Bettina, we're going to get a microphone to you. Bettina's just to my right here towards the front, if someone can bring that microphone. Here comes one now. Just over here, next section over.
Thank you so much, Ryan. Yes, with the Adecco Group, but also with the World Employment Confederation Europe. And I can't resist but sharing that at the World Employment Confederation, we have released a result of our thinking in a manifesto. And the manifesto says, no future of work without social innovation. Obviously, we've got our own ideas on that one, but I'd love to hear from actually every one of you in the panel, if possible, how that resonates with you. Social innovation. Can we continue like we are now, or do we need social innovation?
And Bettina, if you can pass the microphone to Cheryl on your left, and the panel can answer that one, and then we'll come to Cheryl in a minute.
Hi, thank you,
Cheryl
Ryan.
can jump on in.
You've been doing a great job holding down the gender balance in the panel. Thank you. Cheryl Miller from the Digital Leadership Institute, whose mission is inclusive digital transformation. So thank you for you holding up the female end of the panel. And the elephant in the room, obviously, is the panel reflective of the future of work? 17% women and 0% people of color, if I'm not mistaken. And then I think a question that we haven't actually broached, which is the 40% pension gap in Europe. So yes, there is a lack of gender balance across the board, but in certain countries like the Netherlands and like Germany, where it is not okay for women to work outside the home for money, we end up in a very precarious position already today with only 60% income in pension that men receive. So what's the impact when you exaggerate all of the variables that are feeding into that result? How do we manage for that from a social perspective and the gig economy?
Okay, so we've got social innovation and pensions. We'll start with you, Thibault.
So on social innovation, I mean, I think totally, and we've been pointing to examples where I think it is about the money, it is about the funding, but it is in general about how you invent a model of work that takes into account what's not changing. Traditional form of labor is still there, will not cease to exist. I think there was also something posted on that, and it has been predicted for a long time that traditional labor would stop. It's not. But on top of that, there are plenty of other forms. Society is changing, wants to be more inclusive. It's not just that some of us want that. It's just generally in society there's transformation on gender equality, on inclusion in general. And I think it's on all of us to invent the model socially, on top of the money, to just make it work. And I think it's easy to talk about it. I think the bias we've taken at Uber is to just act about it very concretely, see and show tangible data on things we do, the impact it has, and then do more when it works. And on, I think, funding in general, I think I'll just follow Jacques on that one. Funding is key, but I think it has to be a bit of everyone for sure. But then as a company, what we see is that consumers are very smart, they're educated. If anything, they're getting more and more educated because they have more and more information that they know how to go through, and they're willing to pay the price when the product they're consuming or the service is matching their expectations more and more. If anything, vision, purpose, ethical responsibility, reputation is playing a stronger role in how consumers behave. So if they want workers to be treated fairly, if they want fair representation of women and of all categories and backgrounds of life, they know it comes at a price. And as a company, what we have to do is make sure that our strategies for social innovation and funding match what we think customers want, and ultimately it will match out, I think.
Okay, let's go down the row to keep some order to the situation.
I couldn't agree more with Bettina, of course. We are talking exactly about social innovation here in this panel, so I think this is really the future reflection we have to address all together. But I wanted to reply with one simple element, I mean, to the question that I think is very relevant. You know, the pension gap comes from the pay gap. If you earn less, you pay less to the system, and you get back less, I mean, in terms of your pension rights. That's clear. And the only way to address the pay gap is to have positive discrimination in collective bargaining in favor of women. This is exactly what the trade unions have to do. At least I talk about my job, you know. I don't want to discuss about what the others should do. What I know is that we are continuously telling our negotiators in the collective bargaining rounds, you need to introduce a positive discrimination for women in the collective agreements, because this is the only way to recuperate the gender pay gap. There is no other option, because all the other options have been tested and didn't work. So we need really to go for this kind of approach, I think, when it comes to collective agreements and collective bargaining.
Can I press you on what you mean by that positive discrimination? Is it reserving posts for women? Is it supplemental wages?
Yeah. They need to have supplemental wages for some specific conditions and situations, I would say. And this is the only way, I mean, to fill the gap, and to make sure that then the social contribution, not only to pension systems, but in general to social protection systems, will be more equal, I mean, in the medium run, because we cannot wait for the long run. We need to intervene now, because the risk is that, as for journalists and other cases, I mean, for women, I mean, especially the ones that are more precarious and working in the gig economy, etc., well, this pension gap will be doubled in 10, 15 years, and then we will come back to the non-sustainability of our public budgets.
Well, I think of social innovation in two senses. One has to do with the policy aspects, with the technical aspects. How do we design or redesign or reinvent social protection systems that take into account the new circumstances we're facing? And that includes portability and funding and all of that. So we need social innovation in that sense. But we also need social innovation in a much broader and softer sense, I think. And that's, to go back to gender, often occurs to me that the issues that we debate most fiercely and that we care so much about in the OECD, wage gap, leaky pipelines, glass ceilings, quotas on boards, and so on. These are all important issues, but they are, I think, unimaginable luxuries to the vast majority of women in the world who can't go out of their homes, who can't own property, who need permission to work, whose daughters are not being educated, and so on. So I think we need some social innovation and some thinking along those lines as well.
Yeah, social innovation, absolutely. Key for me is it's about work. It's not about the type of contract. If you work, you are insured. If you work, you can have a mortgage. And these are portable rights. On pension, we got good and bad news. So people are getting older. So there's more money you need to provide for the period when you're not working. So we now have situations where if people work 30 years, then they don't work for 30 years. That doesn't gel financially. So I'm quite surprised, although it's going up slightly, that it's a 14% individuals that need to take care of themselves. It's 100%. If there's anything we're seeing in the labor market is it's getting more fragmented, it's getting more individual, and you need to take care of yourself because an employer is not going to take care of you for your life. Government won't do it yourself. You can have partners like a union, you can organize yourself, but you need to take care of yourself. If you want to quit when you're 58, yeah, well then either you need to have an inheritance or do something or work on or live on very little money. If not, you need to work until you're 70 because you're going to live until you're 87. Whatever. That's good news. And where does the money come from? Where should the money come from? Not from government, eh? We have got a massive debt issue everywhere. We cannot pile it up anymore.
Is that good news? Let's do a show of hands. Work till 70 but live till 87. Who thinks that's a good idea? Oh, that is a very unpopular idea. Okay. We need some reality check out there in the audience. Arnaud, and then we'll come to the woman in the red jacket and the gentleman in the white shirt.
Yeah. Getting back to Jack's point, the one you mentioned before, is that the best, the most strategic asset for a worker is basically his skill set and the ability to have skills that match the demand from employers, from platforms as well. So I think at some point it's also like a collective responsibility. It will be from schools, of course. This is why at Indeed we've partnered with universities to make students understand that the job market is changing really fast, but also from companies to make sure that their employees are trained to the new, not only new like technical skills, but more the new way of thinking, the new way of approaching your career, which is not a linear career anymore, which is going to be like more protean approach, where you're going to jump from one type of job to the other, and from that one you're going to find new opportunities to move to something different again. So there is still a collective responsibility from all the institutions and all the stakeholders to make sure that you have at least, as a worker, kind of equal access to this opportunity to get trained and to have the right skills that all the companies are looking for. Because right now, if we did research on transformational talents, this is how we call basically the guys, the workforce that all the companies in the world want to hire. They're all like struggling, fighting to hire those people who have like the right mix of soft skills, interpersonal skills, and analytical, strategic skills, basically. And you need as a worker to at least expect from the people who you work for to give you this kind of training to maintain those skills and to ensure your employability. And then you're right, if the worker does not feel like empowered to do so, it will not happen. It shouldn't. It's not going to happen in a top-down way. Each worker should really understand that he will have to design. He will have more and more opportunities, and it will be his responsibility as well to seize them, to seize those opportunities.
Time to bring in two more questions. I need to get a microphone up in this section. The woman here in the red jacket needs the microphone, and then the gentleman with the white shirt. I think, yeah, okay, that's coming. So, ma'am, we'll go to you first.
Thank you so much. Deborah James with the Center for Economic and Policy Research based in Washington, D.C. I'm glad to see a focus on some of the solutions and to see companies that are taking strides and making changes. But we feel that there is an element to be brought into, which is the business model of some of the gig economies. And we feel that a lot of the business model is really based on avoiding regulation, on ensuring a stable supply of cheap labor, and on avoidance of paying taxes. And we're seeing now some of these companies actually using a way to try to get this business model locked in. Specifically, if you think about the fact that OECD is actually doing this thing to try to get companies to pay more taxes through the BEPS, at the same time, a lot of these companies are working through trade agreements to try to lock in provisions where they don't have to have a local presence in a country to operate so that they cannot be required to be taxed. And this is happening under the guise of e-commerce, and they're doing it in every single trade agreement that's being negotiated right now in the world, and particularly in the WTO, and it's something that civil society is very opposed to. So just when we're thinking about the policy environment, when we talk about national regulation, the international regulations such as tax and trade, I think also should be taken into account. And the other short comment I just want to make, I really appreciate Luca's contributions here. I appreciate Ronnie's position as the only woman, but just to acknowledge that Luca is the only person here representing the vast majority of people around the world who are workers. And I just wanted to also get the panel's comments. It seems like one of the best ways to ensure that all people can share more equitably in the future digital economy, considering the productivity wage gap we've seen over the last 30 years, is for governments to have a commitment to full employment and to be able to achieve that through policies like reduced work hours. And that's something that I think has come out of the labor movement, and the economists in my office are very much in favor of, and I just enjoy the panel's comments about that. Thank you very much.
Great. And then we'll take the gentleman in the white shirt and then the answers.
Thank you. I'm Agustin from Argentina, and I will ask all of your help to make this question. Could you raise your hand if you are under 30 years old, please? Well, thank you. I have like 10%.
We've got one optimist and 25 millennials.
Thank you. So, half of the world population is beneath 30 years old. The future of work is going to affect us in a big change. Today I had the mandate to be chair of Y20, the youth engagement group of the G20. We have a mission to speak about the future of work to the head of states. My question is, which advices do you give us, the young people, to say to the heads of states? Which changes do we need to prepare for that? Thanks.
Okay, maybe we'll work backwards this time. I know.
Maybe you can repeat the question.
Hang on, sorry.
Oh,
yeah. Could you just repeat the main point at the end of the question?
Sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry for my English. Which advices would you give the young people to then claim to the head of states? And the topic is future of work. Sorry.
I will leave that to you, right?
The advice I
it's
can...
getting back to the first question.
There's something very interesting. If you would ask your parents on what kind of education you would do, they will probably still lean towards a nice white-collar job, because that was very secure in the old days. So nowadays, if I, well, you got more hair, so you wouldn't be my son, but I would say either you do something with your hands or you do something with your personality. Find a job that fits you, either with your hands or with your personality, because these, for a long time, will not be automated through AI. It will be supported by AI, but not really. So find something like that, or start your own business, because then you don't need to, it's all yours.
I'm so much with you, Jacques. We just, like we mentioned before, that we are like partnering with universities, so we go and meet students and try to basically help them understand what's changing in our world. And we were so surprised, I can tell you, so surprised that such a high percentage of 20 years old students want to replicate exactly the same path as their parents. They've been totally brainwashed by people like my age or older about like this kind of linear career, this kind of putting so much like
even outside of Europe. I wonder if there's a Europe bias in that data, because that
Probably
strikes
right,
me as
but-
very predictable in Europe, but I can't imagine Vietnamese
Yeah.
families are giving
You're
you the
probably
same
right.
answer.
In emerging markets, there's probably, I mean, some people will probably value more the diversity of the opportunities they have. Maybe just because their parents maybe didn't have such a linear like career. Maybe, but we were really surprised in universities that even like students doing like master degree, etc., they tend to think that the world of opportunities is still more or less the one as it used to be 20 years before, except that we understand that they can become entrepreneur. But the concept of being like having several like activities and being able to work like as a slasher, you know, where you have like one primary job, one secondary, different sources of activities, and have your kind of hobbies that are connected to your job as well. This is sometimes, we have to show examples of people who did that and who are extremely successful doing that, because sometimes it's not in their radar yet.
Ronnie.
That's interesting to me, because in my experience, it's the opposite. When I was your age, it never occurred to me that I wouldn't succeed and have a standard of living higher than my parents. What was it called? The revolution of rising expectations. That was just the inevitable trajectory of life. That's not true anymore, at least in my experience. My grandchildren are anxious, and they no longer have that expectation. But I took your question to mean, what should the Y20 tell the governments? I think you should tell them, we're watching you and we vote.
And then make sure you actually do vote.
Yes, and then do it.
Well, first of all, I would like to mention the first questions. I think that the two aspects that you mentioned, tax avoidance and exploiting cheap labor, I mean, is exactly unfortunately what happens, at least from some of the companies, especially in the multinational dimension that operate in the digital economy. And this is something we have to address, you know. It's not only about the things that we discussed earlier, it's also about this, I mean, and this is something that really needs some, let's say, uprising of multilateralism. There is multilateralism to be discussed, I mean, in a lot of panels and also in the ministerial following tomorrow and after tomorrow. I mean, I think this is really a point that we need to make also as civil society organizations. We have to press and push for that, because this is really crucial. And when it comes to what the young people should tell the governments of the G20, well, I think you should simply ask them not to prevent you to organize and to be represented collectively. Please don't allow them to impede you to make a revolution. You need to do it, and you need to be able to do it. But you know, if they put obstacles all the time, and if they play you against each other in a purely individual dimension, there will be no future for the new generation. So really ask for not having obstacles for a revolution to be made and for organizing collectively.
You got that? So on the first point, I think it's a great point on representation. And like I've said, I think for companies, it's essential that we use all of the existing forums. And I think there should be collective bargaining, sector-wide representation, discussions. As Uber, really we're trying to show the way on this by showing the other tech platforms that we don't live in a bubble. We can work together with governments, with unions, with everyone, where there's a forum where people can be constructive and actually lead to action. That's what we want, is always that there is action. That these forums are very much important, multilateral, global. On the tax point, there is a forum in the OECD on future of work. There are some specific forums that are now leading to action. But I think what companies really need to understand is that they have direct access to their consumers and to society more than ever before. They can know exactly what consumers care about, and this is extremely powerful. And that means consumers in the end consumer sense, but also the partners they work with. In our case, the courier delivers, the restaurants, the drivers, we listen to them on a daily basis now, and that's representation. It's not the same form of representation, but it's a very powerful one. And we learned the hard way. I think there's a question on this, like, why did they have to fight so hard? We learned the hard way that if we don't pay attention, we pay the price, because our brand will suffer, because our service will suffer. And I think that's, for us, it's a very important lesson as tech. And I think there's a global wake-up call on tech to understand that with their change and disruption and new services comes responsibility on top of the other channels. So it's not destroying or replacing the other channels, it's coming on top. And I think to the second point of what would you, could you say to some of the heads of state as a Y20? I think the point around voting is a great one, and I suffer when I see the voting and participation rates in the elections in the Western world of the younger population. I never really understand it. When I was a student here in Paris at the Sorbonne at some point, there were big demonstrations in France against an election, because in the second round, the populist party was there. That was in 2001. And all of my fellow students were telling me, you need to go and demonstrate. And to a lot of them, I said, I voted in the first round, did you? And the rate of vote in this class was probably 30% of people who actually went to vote. And this is still a very powerful message that I think sometimes young people still forget. Voting is powerful. But on top of that, I would say, demand that skilling and reskilling is top of their priorities. And I think some heads of state have understood that, because the economy moves so fast. And I see it in my hiring for our employees, that the rate of learning is just getting faster and faster. So it's no longer right to invest billions and billions and billions in shiny new infrastructure that you can then pitch to the outside world. What's more important is, are young people and people throughout their life getting reskilled, and how? And who is responsible for that? And less is probably the state. More and more, it's probably multiple stakeholders, including employers, including unions, including information sources out there. And I think if they understand that and they do the right thing on a few things on the regulatory side, they can probably channel a huge amount of available resources and money for younger people today.
I think we might even be able to see the beginnings of some very angry youth power in Italy right now. We've seen it in the most recent election, and we're going to see it whenever the next election comes. It's the youngest who are the most angry in Italy, and they don't come with some of the assumptions and support that we might expect for things like the European Union that happens in other countries. I'm going to shake it up a little bit, first by giving you the results of the survey. So if we can get the survey up on the screens behind me. It's a very clear result, actually. 48% of you have said that governments are the group that you think most should take responsibility. Unfortunately, we made you choose between those five. I think the correct answer is probably most or all of them. And then that was very clear. Employers come second, schools and individuals. Labor unions not seen as having a role there. I defer to you.
Either there are no unions in the room, or they don't want to take the responsibility.
Now, I'm kind of amazed that we got 72 minutes into this session and we didn't really talk about automation, artificial intelligence, robots. So I don't mean to send us into a rabbit hole, but I do think we can't get through 90 minutes of the future of work without touching on those topics. So I'm going to throw it out there, the possibility that if we remember the context that we've seen a lot of displaced, left behind, angry people in areas that suffered from globalization, where factories went elsewhere, where people weren't ready to switch it up into a new profession, and you saw a lot of regions, a lot of individuals struggling there. I think that tended to affect men more than women because of the jobs that were displaced by that whole era of globalization. In the next era of change, I'm going to put it to the panel. I'm going to ask you for your feedback. Are we going to actually see the rise of angry women around the world as automation, AI, robotization also goes into service sectors and jobs that are more female dominated? So are we going to start to see the jobs that you previously couldn't outsource? You know, people could only do nursing if they were physically present. A robot couldn't do a lot of nursing. It certainly couldn't do brain surgery. If someone was going to file your nails, they kind of had to be there. They don't actually have to be there now if you look at some of the advances in technology. So I'm going to throw it out there, and I'm not going to make you take on the burden, Ronnie. I'm going to make the men answer the question as well. Jacques, jump on in.
Yeah, well, actually, we'd better have digital in healthcare. Because if we don't get digital in healthcare, roughly 40% of the people who leave education need to be in healthcare. So we're going to be massively short with hands at the bed. Because what's the essence of healthcare? The essence of healthcare is taking care of people, which is a human contact. It's not about distributing medicine, it's not about cleaning, it's not about carrying, and that's what robots will do. So we're in desperate need of robots. As I mentioned earlier, it's not Armageddon. 1 in 6 jobs will disappear, but say self-driving cars, and drivers might disappear. But we're massively short of mid-level technicians, and we can, within 3 to 5 years, reskill all these people to fill that gap. But 60% of job content will change. So you will only be angry if you left it too late to take the initiative and embrace digital as an employer, as an employee, or as a government. So we're actually quite positive. We need digital to have these gaps filled. We need digital to improve the productivity of people, because if we cannot improve the productivity of people, we cannot pay them more, and salary will be very sluggish. So, you know, bring it on, embrace it. We will have better jobs because of it.
Could I answer that?
Absolutely.
First of all, I think there are already a lot of angry women out there, and part of it has nothing to do with automation. In fact, on the contrary. But why do you assume that filing nails or nursing are the primary opportunities for women?
I don't, but the numbers in those professions, they're female dominated.
So
That's not
as
me
we have,
projecting.
As we have fewer manicurists, maybe we'll have more electricians
I hope
or
so.
nuclear physicists or so on.
I'm all in agreement, but I don't want to hope. I want to deliver. I prefer action over hope. Luca.
No, I wanted simply to say that to a certain extent, until a certain limit, I think, machines, robots, etc., will help us, and that's for sure. And we don't have to avoid this revolution to happen. And we will have to manage it, of course, and I think we will be successful in doing that. But there is one problem that we need to take into consideration, that we should avoid to lose the human dimension in all this. I mean, because until it's a factory, you know, okay, I understand. There will be always someone controlling what the machines are doing and if they are doing properly. But the point is that when it comes to healthcare, any other kind of service that are for people, I mean, well, it's better to have a human being in front of you instead of a machine, I think. And so we should try to limit a bit, I mean, this revolution to go too far, at least in the sectors that are really services for people, I think.
I really see it as well as an opportunity for workers to refocus exactly on this like human dimension. So artificial intelligence is often like doing the tasks that were not so adding much value. Like I was discussing with a doctor working in emergency care in hospital, etc., complaining about how much time she was dedicating to entering basically data into a computer, instead of being with the patients, with people who are sick, and IoT, Internet of Things, with like collecting the data and what's happening with the patient. Exactly, care at home, exactly. You just send the data directly to the system. It's like more time dedicated for doctors, for nurses to spend to interact with clients. The same for a radiologist, digital like medical imagery. Well, the day we have all those scans uploaded into a server with machine learning, but the reports from a scan or an IRM can be basically produced automatically. It's more time for the doctor to spend with his patient and to explain what's going on. How many of you have experienced situations where you're with the doctor and he doesn't have time to explain, to share with you what really means the diagnosis and the results of your blood test or anything, because he has to move to the next patient. That's more opportunities as well. And artificial intelligence will put more emphasis on what like cannot be done by the machine, which is creativity on one side and human interactions on the other side. And just like investing massively on these two dimensions and making sure as a worker that you grow those kind of skills, if we can call them skills, it will ensure you the best way to remain like highly employable in this disrupted market, I think.
Thibaut, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, and very quickly, I think I agree with everything that's been said. The good news, indeed, I think we have a bit of time. We often overestimate the impact of the speed of changes, but underestimate their impact. And in this case, we have time to adjust as a society. And like everyone said, it does lead to creation of a lot of new types of jobs that otherwise wouldn't exist. I think still, what I'd say is in the places where it does bring change, which can, for workers, be disruptive to their careers, to their skills, it is again on everyone, and employers need to take the perspective of private sector to reskill, to adjust skills, to show the way to people, because otherwise I think we get down into a trap of anxiety, which I think we hear a lot. Like right now, I think there's a question on the screen, which is why so much populism right now in Europe and around the world? Some of it is totally fair. It's this anxiety around transformations, but I think perhaps we're not vocal enough as companies, as leaders in all of our sectors, at the optimistic messages as well that can come. Creation of opportunities. We were talking with Jack over lunch. When you look at the number of sectors that have created jobs in the past 20 years, it's quite insane. And perhaps people don't hear that much, and we're not showing them the way to how they can benefit. Very often they suffer without seeing the upside. Well, it's on us to show the upside and train everyone, reskill everyone for that upside.
Well, then there's a really concrete case in point with Uber, because ultimately, I'd be shocked if you weren't moving to have a lot of self-driving cars. You know, I wouldn't dare speculate what role you see for human drivers, but clearly you're going to have self-driving cars in the future. Are you sort of planning now for what the adjustment process is so that you're not switching off that job pool for people from one day to the next when you do move that towards the self-driving cars?
Yeah, totally. We're starting to think about it. I think to your comment, Luca, about the human factor, just a reminder that the reason why we may want as a society, it can't be just Uber on its own, but all of us, move to self-driving cars is safety. It's incredibly more safe. It will be. It's not now, but it will be incredibly more safe for all of us. Every year in France or Germany, it's 20,000 people who die by using or being hit by a car, which is, when you think about it, it's an entire city every year, or small city. So that's the reason. It's a very human reason. We want safer roads for all of us. Now, how we adapt, again, it will take probably way more time than we think. It won't be a switch, to your point, because you will always need for peak times, because human behavior will not change. We will want to go for dinner. We want to go to the cinema or to schools or to work at the same times because of sunlight, because of our habits. There are peak times where we'll need human drivers for a long time, for sure. But as gradually self-driving ramps up, it's on us to find a model for drivers who want to reskill themselves to get into other jobs on the side. It could be electricians, it could be maintaining vehicles. So we've started thinking about this, and we've started talking publicly about it to see what's the opinions of some of the sectors that have had that revolution, including, for example, in Italy, in France, in the UK, and Germany, automation in factories designing and manufacturing goods, where it went from 0% machines to up to 80% machines. So we want to get the input from the experts and from the regulators and unions to see what can be done to help workers adapt to that big change over time.
Yeah, it's fascinating on that point with the manufacturing. The automation can help bring manufacturing to high-cost countries. It just doesn't necessarily bring manufacturing jobs back. It just brings the actual processes. Quickly, Jacques, because I am not an algorithm, so my human intelligence failed to bring in Stefano Scarpetta, who's one of the OECD's labor experts, to give his reflections on what we've all been talking about. So maybe, Stefano, I'm going to bring you up onto the stage so that you can give us your insight. Oh, there we go. Look. Very magnanimous. Thank you, Jacques.
Don't play Jack. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you very much. And let me thank actually the panelists, because I thought that this was really an exciting and interesting panel. You did a great job, Ryan, in moderating that. I was just concerned at the beginning because I felt there was a little bit too much consensus. I was expecting a bit more tensions, and indeed, actually, the temperature rose at some point, which I was really waiting and looking for that. Now, I have an impossible job here because I'm supposed to try to summarize this very rich discussion, and not only that, but also linking to the work we're doing at OECD. So this is impossible. Let me just give you a few highlights of what I took from this very interesting and very rich discussion. First, whenever we talk about the future of work, we are pulled either in one direction or the other. Either we are among the optimists, the future will be fantastic, a lot of aspirational potential out there, or we are trapped into the camp of the pessimists. Actually, there's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of anxiety, a lot of challenges people are facing. And I think what I took from this panel is that actually with the good policies, and I think the survey that we run, say who should do what, actually suggests that you need government policies, but I think you need also intervention coordinated with all the different stakeholders, where these are companies, where these are the unions, of course, where these are actually the civil society, the youth, and other groups that actually are on the ground and actually can make a difference. That's the first point. So it's we can move into the optimistic camp if we can move policies in the right direction. This is one of the messages I took from that. The second, I think, Raya, you were really pushing to that. The changes is now. The future is now. We don't have to wait for see how things will. There are a lot of changes happening now, which are very much associated with the digital transformation. The other point that you raise is that actually we're talking about very deep and rapid changes. We're not talking about small incremental changes, and therefore much of the same with some adaptation might not actually work. So which of course put a lot of pressure on all of us, I think, policymakers, those from international organizations, the civil society, and the social partners themselves. The other point is that exactly, it's not black and white. So it's not that all the new jobs are going to be good or are going to be bad. There is a huge degree of heterogeneity. I think you have been discussing about the concept of flexibility. Some people are just driving with this increased flexibility. This gives them more opportunity to work from home, to work where they want, and so on and so forth. There is another side of flexibility, which is actually something that people suffer from, because it's not something that they choose and give them a significant degree of uncertainty, anxiety, and lack of any perspective of the future. So again, it's not black and white. Flexibility is a major thing that these new technology bring to us, but I think we have to give people the tools to actually use this flexibility, exploit this flexibility, and yet be able to have a job and also a prospect in their life. Now Thibault made, and this is one, in my view, was one of the highlights of the conversation when Thibault said, listen to them. We have to listen to our workers. And actually, the highlight was really when Luca said, congratulate Thibault for the progress that Uber has been made to actually work better with their own workers. I don't think a couple of years ago this conversation would have taken place, so congratulations, Thibault. I think you got the blessing also from the ETUC, which is a major step forward. But I think the point of listening is that precisely because there is a lot of heterogeneity, I think we cannot pretend that we know what bothers or what worries people, workers, and I think the traditional categories of high skill, low skill, even men, woman, young person, older age person, and so on, I don't think they work. They are in different jobs in different locations for different companies, and they might be facing different challenges in keeping their job or move ahead on their career. So listening to them means also targeting better policy to the specific needs that people have. Luca was saying that we should stop fighting the technological changes, but I think what he meant also and what he said is that this does not mean we should fall into the trap of technological determinism, that whatever technology will bring to us, we should just take it and adopt it and face it. I think, again, policy can really make a difference. The additional point is that there was several reflections on that, saying that we are living in a world in which activities are more fragmented, and to some extent, some of the traditional risks that workers were protected against through their job, their contract with an employer, actually are now shifting back to them. Because people may have different jobs, even at the same time, they may move from one job to another, from one career to another. So this notion that you get social protection through your unique, full-time, open-ended, and job for life type of contract is no longer really working for an increasing number of people. So if that's the issue, you have to shift the focus of tools to individuals and not only through the job, the contract that these people have. And I think the point about the social innovation that I think was raised is absolutely essential. Which brings me to the other point, which was about the paradox, fragmentation of activities on the other end, perhaps more need, Luca, to actually have collective action, so to help workers getting together. How you reconcile these two things, I don't have the answer. We actually had a seminar on the future work and collective bargaining, in which we actually try to document all the different innovations that are taking place, unions themselves actually helping gig workers getting together, have their voice raised. So there's a lot to be learned from what is already happening on the ground. I think to some extent the point is that given the dimension of the issue we are talking about here, the answer cannot just be more and better skills to everyone, better labor market regulation, better labor market policy. We have to broaden it up to a whole of government. This is not surprising coming from the OECD, but I think there is a great sense to that. Some of you mentioned that individual workers, whether gig workers, cannot get together, cannot actually bargain together because this is against competition law. So of course you have to bring the other dimension, Minister of Finance, other key policymakers into this discussion. Now, the big elephant in the room, and I think Jacques was
It will have to be the last
twice,
elephant
and
in
that's
the
the
room.
last one, is who pays for all of that? I don't have the answer, but I think some of the suggestion about making sure all companies pay a fair amount of their taxes, so the BEPS project, we can do a lot better with the policy, with the money we spend on social programs if we know exactly how to target on those in greatest need. But I think basically the responsibility in all the companies actually pay also, not only paying, but be engaged and be part of the solution through providing training to the workers, helping them, improving their working conditions, and so on and so forth. So I'll leave it at that, but I found this panel actually very interesting and exciting. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you, Stefano. And yes, a round of applause. Indeed, for all of our panelists, because we are at exactly 4:30, so in a rare moment in conference history, we're going to call it quits there. We're going to let you move on to the next session on time. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of your questions, especially on the two far wings of the room, but thank you very much for your engagement. We were reading the comments online, and we really appreciate it. Thank you very much to all of you. Normally it's with you.
So much fantastic.
Excellent. Oh, I know. My bag's down here. Here, my card. The president for